HTTP methods are the basic foundation of communication when you are dealing with the internet. If you are on a browser and you are surfing the internet, you are using HTTP methods at some way, shape, or form. And in this video, we're going to kind of get down into the basics of what those methods are so that you can understand the basic communication on how one client talks to a server or how your browser communicates with web pages like YouTube, Facebook, and all these other web pages. One of the things that always fascinated me was that when you go to a YouTube page, or if you go to Netflix online on a browser, or you go to any page on a browser, there is so much network traffic that happens in the back end. You just see a page load, you may see some content, you may do some clicking around, you may use whatever page for whatever purpose. But in the back end, there's a lot of communication for that web page to work. And that's because based on how the developers made the back end of the web server that you're communicating with, there may need to be a lot of traffic, or maybe just one time. There's just so much interesting ways to be able to send data back and forth. The most common one that you'll see is a get method. This is the one that allows you to basically traverse most pages. It's the main bread and butter method of communication that you will see. Without doing any coding or without doing anything, you usually naturally use a get method when you simply just type in whatever web page you want to go to and hit enter. It will naturally, most of the time, do a GET request, and that GET request will basically be sent out to the server from your client, which is your web browser. And from that, it will send you back information. A lot of the times it will be HTML content. So usually you will receive back content data. The browser understands this and is able to put this onto the screen for you. And that's great, but there's also other forms of data that you could use with a GET request. You don't have to send back an HTML file or just HTML content. You could send back files if you wanted to. You could send back data in itself in something called a JSON object format, where inside of that data you can have key value pairs, or you can have a list or an array of information. It's just based on how that data is shaped. There's a lot of things that you can get back from a web server. It just kind of depends on what the developers want you to get back from that web server, right? And most of the time, if you type in youtube.com, you're going to get back some sort of HTML content, which then loads in a bunch of other things like CSS, JavaScript, X, Y, and Z in order to make the page work. And what's cool about using a GET method or any of these methods is that you don't need a browser to do it. It's just one of the easiest ways to do it. You can go into your Google Chrome console in your browser and basically emulate the same thing of making that GET request. In fact, you can do it in almost any language. In fact, you can do it in almost any scripting language. Even before any of this, a lot of the times I would use something that came with Windows or Linux. A lot of the times, it doesn't matter. It's called curl. And this actual app that's added into most OSs allows you to be able to pull data from another server. And it does the exact same thing. You're basically making this request, and you'll make a GET request to be able to receive back that information. And so it's really cool to be able to know that it doesn't really matter if you're using a client, browser, or you're using any scripting language or any language at all. It's usually agnostic in its approach on how you're able to receive information with this standard. The next method we're going to talk about is the post request. Now, this is where things get a little bit interesting, because you would think that a GET request would allow you to get data from a server. So you would think, oh, okay, well, that means that a post request means that I am sending data to a server. And although that is correct, this is where things kind of can diverge and be different based on the scenario. At the end of the day, yes, a post request is used to send data to the server, but it can also be used as a way to send information back to yourself in particular. It all depends on how the developer programmed out the backend or the web server that basically accepts those methods. So for example, if I'm doing a post request, you're going to want to have some sort of body or object of data that the post request is normally accepting, and you'll send that along with your information. And when the server side sees it, it can actually update things on the server side, whether it's through a database or through something else, or it could use that as some sort of arguments to give you back information. A lot of the times when I'm creating out a web server and I'm doing the backend for API stuff, a lot of the times I like to use post requests to make it so that the front end has to have arguments passed over. This just kind of changes up how you approach writing things for the front end and back end. But normally it doesn't matter, just as long as the main goal is actually done, whether it's sending information to the server or you getting back information that is maybe filtered based on the arguments you added in the body. And this brings me back to the GET request for a moment, because when we were talking about this from the beginning, I mentioned how, yes, you're able to get information from a server, right? And so then you would think of a post request as sending information to a server. And just as I said, well, for a post request, you can send information to a server and it will send you back information. A GET request can do the same with something called query parameters. These query parameters are something that I guarantee you've probably seen at the end of a URL string. It'll have like a question mark and some sort of flags with values that are added to the actual URL string. That is added so that on the server side, if someone built up some code to basically read query parameters, it could basically essentially do the same thing, where you basically get back filtered information based on what you had in your arguments for your query parameters. So this kind of helps you to see that GET and POST can do the same thing, and it's based on how the developer on the back end built out the actual APIs and the concepts for how he wants the front end to communicate with his back end. So the next two methods are put and patch. They are essentially the same thing, and I like to group them in my head kind of like the post request, except the major difference is again about the backend concept. And this kind of is more of understanding the standard of what normally people would make for their development backends. This doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly what will happen, but this is normally what you would expect if you're writing, let's say, out an API and you wanted to follow a standard, or if you were a person trying to understand an API and it has these different methods, you'd usually assume this first. A put or a patch is usually to update a specific item that's in the database or in the backend. But the difference between the put and the patch is that the put is idempotent, meaning if I actually made a request that is the same type of request numerous times, it's not really going to do any sort of effect or change on the back end, as opposed to a patch request, where if I kept doing the same request over and over, it's most likely going to have some sort of change or side effect or some sort of constant added key values to whatever object or whatever backend or whatever database you're actually interacting with. And so that's a little weird to understand, but I would say the best thing for that is check the documentation of whatever API you're doing, because usually if there's a difference between a put and a patch request, there's most likely some sort of thing where you're trying to update a specific item that's on the backend side, and there's a difference between actually constantly updating that and no effect happening, or constantly updating that and you'll either have more or you'll have some sort of added notes to it. There's something else there where a patch is going to have a side effect rather than a put request, where if the request was the same, there's not going to be any effect. We have the delete method or the delete request. That is what you think it is in particular. You'll usually put an ID or a variable that contains like a string of the ID of whatever you're trying to delete. But essentially a delete method is just going to delete whatever you're trying to get from the back end. Me as a developer doesn't necessarily have to use delete for deleting something off of a database. It's just something that another person would naturally normally think of, and so it's usually used for deleting things from your account that you want to do programmably. Now, these final three methods are methods that you don't normally use or interact with directly. They're kind of more of concepts that are methods, but are something that will either happen automatically or something that you may add to your request, and that's considered a method. But we'll get into that. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the pre-flight method. So a pre-flight check is a method that is used to see if the actual request can be made, and it's usually used for cross-origin connections and communication. And that usually just means that if, let's say, you are trying to communicate with server B, right, and you are on server A, and your server A has a different web address than server B, and server B has requirements for communicating with specific websites and web servers and things like that, right? Or it will have a thing where it will allow you to communicate with everyone, right? Normally, if it does have some sort of cross-origin information that needs to be established, usually a pre-flight check will be done to ensure that the actual request can be made. And this actually happens automatically. This isn't something that normally you craft and do yourself. You can make an options method and do it that way, but essentially the options method is the same as the pre-flight check. It's just the difference between it is that the pre-flight check actually happens on its own, as opposed to crafting up an options request to see what you can actually do. Then there's the upgrade method. This method is something I've only seen for WebSockets. Literally, it's just to upgrade the HTTP communication from using HTTP methods to using a WebSocket protocol. That's all this is, and this happens automatically when you are creating a WebSocket connection. So nothing crazy there, but again, it's one of those ones that you would never really do yourself. This happens automatically. And the last one we'll talk about is the head method. This is exactly the same as a GET request, with one major difference being is that you do not get back the body information, you only get back the header information. And what's funny about this is that the GET method also gives you back the header information anyway. So if you really just wanted the header information, just doing a GET request is fine. But also if you needed to skip over that and just wanted to know something as far as the status information on what's going to happen, the reason, any other information besides the body, you could just use a head method, maybe most likely for testing, or maybe most likely for figuring out what's going on with that endpoint. But that's basically it for the head method. There's nothing else really that you would use it for. It's not as, I would say, impactful as much as the get method or the post method or the delete method, because again, you can get that header information from using one of those other methods in particular. So getting back head information is most likely just used for testing. And that's about it for these methods in particular. There are some other methods that are here and there, but again, this is just for the basics. If you are more interested, I left links down in the description below. And if you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you can. And if you have any comments, concerns, questions, anything like that, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. And other than that, I hope the rest of your day goes well. Peace, everyone.